Good morning and welcome to the 23rd meeting of the Education and Skills Committee in 2019. Can I remind everyone present to turn their mobile phones and other devices to silent for the duration of the meeting. Before we move to agenda item 1, declaration of interest, I'd like to put on record the committee's thanks to Tavish Scott for his service not only to this committee but to the Parliament, and wish him well in his future endeavours. And if we move to agenda item 1, which is declaration of interest from our new member, Gail Ross, who we welcome to committee today.
Thank you, Convener. As per my register of interest, I am I'm on the board of North Highland College.
Thank you. Can we also thank Gordon MacDonald, the previous member of the committee, who has now gone on to do other committee work in the Parliament. And if we can move quickly to agenda item 2, which is a decision in taking business in private, and can I seek permission to have agenda items 6 and 7 in private today, and whether to take future reviews of evidence of Disclosure Scotland Bill in private. Approval? Thank you. Are members content to take future reviews of evidence in private too? Thank you. That's very helpful. Move to agenda item 3, which is the first evidence session on Disclosure Scotland Bill. The committee is beginning with evidence from the Scottish Government Bill team, including officials from Disclosure Scotland. And can I welcome to committee this morning Kevin Lee, Disclosure Bill's Manager, Disclosure Scotland; Gerard Hart, Director of Policy and Protection Services, Disclosure Scotland; and Ailsa Heine, Senior Principal Legal Officer from the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. And could I invite you to give some opening remarks? Thank you.
Good morning, Convener and committee members, and thank you for the opportunity to provide an opening statement on the bill. The bill builds on the reforms achieved under the Age of Criminal Responsibility Act and the Management of Offenders Act, both recently passed by the Scottish Parliament. The main purpose of the bill is to strengthen the barring service to maintain the Scottish Government's ability to protect the most vulnerable in society, whilst delivering a range of positive and proportionate reforms to the disclosure regime in Scotland. Since November 2016, when the Deputy First Minister announced the review of Scotland's disclosure regime, we have engaged extensively with stakeholders to achieve that balance. Last summer, following pre-consultation engagement with over 300 individuals and organisations and an online survey that generated more than 800 responses, we undertook the statutory public consultation on disclosure, which was distributed widely to stakeholders, including all organisations registered with Disclosure Scotland. The consultation received 353 responses from a broad cross-section of Scottish life, including individuals, charities, sports associations, advocacy groups and private sector businesses. This engagement with our stakeholders has helped shape the bill that has come before Parliament. Part 1 of the bill creates a legislative framework for the state disclosure of criminal history and other information, reducing the number of disclosure products in order to streamline and simplify the process for applicants for disclosure. The bill gives disclosure applicants greater control over the sharing of disclosure information by separating the application and the individual's request to make that information available to a third party into 2 distinct stages. This is an important improvement on the current process and will allow individuals to apply for a review of disclosure information before it is seen by a third party. For review applications, the bill establishes new procedures to have childhood conviction information, other relevant information and removable convictions taken off a person's disclosure, and sets out the role of the independent reviewer who will make determinations on such review applications. For childhood convictions, the bill provides that convictions for offences committed while under the age of 18 years will no longer be automatically disclosed. Instead, the Scottish Government will have to decide in each case whether or not to include such information, and if it is included, they will need to give reasons to the applicant about why such information is relevant to the disclosure purpose and ought to be disclosed. The Scottish Government recognises the important role that police other relevant information, known as ORI, plays in safeguarding, and it is vital that it continues to be available to protect the public. The main reform in the bill is introducing statutory guidance, which will be issued by Scottish ministers to the Chief Constable, who must have regard to the guidance when exercising functions under this part of the bill. There will also be statutory review mechanisms to have ORI removed from a disclosure. In relation to removable convictions, the bill ends the current process of having to apply to the Sheriff and replaces it with an internal application to Disclosure Scotland, followed by a right to apply to the independent reviewer. In summary, the bill provides for a two-step process where decisions made by Disclosure Scotland in relation to childhood convictions or removable convictions, or the Chief Constable in relation to ORI, may be subject to independent review, followed by a right of appeal to the Sheriff on a point of law only. This will all take place before the disclosure is made available to a third party, and we will ensure the process is less burdensome for the applicant and provide a single, streamlined outcome for the applicant. The bill also provides that nobody under 16 should have access to the state disclosure system, mirroring arrangements in the rest of the UK. However, provision is made for exceptions where it is considered appropriate in the circumstances to provide the disclosure, but there is an absolute prohibition on anyone under 16 joining the PVG scheme. Turning to Part 2 and the changes made to the Protecting Vulnerable Groups scheme, the bill introduces a mandatory PVG scheme for people working with vulnerable groups, something which the Parliament's Health and Sport Committee said there was a compelling case for in their 2017 report on child protection in sport. The PVG scheme is a lifetime membership scheme and, in its present form, will simply continue to increase in size. The bill aims to address this by introducing a renewable time-limited membership of 5 years. The bill replaces the concept of doing regulated work with a list of core activities giving rise to regulated roles that trigger PVG scheme membership for paid and voluntary activities, with the intention of ensuring the scheme focuses on those who hold power or influence over children and protected adults. The bill also brings certain regulated roles outside Scotland into scope of the PVG scheme, responding to the well-documented episodes of exploitation and abuse in the international aid sector. The bill also makes provision for Scottish ministers to have new powers to impose conditions and limitations on scheme members while they are under consideration for listing. Where it applies, this will ensure the vulnerable are protected from those individuals who pose a serious risk of harm. Finally, local authorities will be able to make referrals to Disclosure Scotland within the context of their normal adult and child protection roles when there is no employer involved who can make a referral under the PVG Act. This addresses the safeguarding gap that exists in the care environment where, in particular, self-directed support is much more widely used since 2007. My colleagues and I will now be pleased to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Can I move to questions from Mr Gray?
Thanks very much. Could I ask for a little bit more detail of the thinking on the move in the PVG scheme, the proposed move from a lifetime membership to a 5-year time-limited membership?
Yes. Well, the PVG scheme has been in operation for 8 years now, and we've seen in that time how much the scheme has inflated beyond what was the size what it was originally thought it would be. Our research tells us that as much as 20% of people are in the scheme just now, which is over 1.2 million people are in the scheme right now. 20% of those are not actually doing regulated work anymore. So what you have then is a situation where Disclosure Scotland is monitoring these individuals on a daily basis when there's actually no kind of safeguarding return for that, and that was kind of the thinking behind the time-limited aspect.
So the key issue is that membership of the scheme is monitored all the time.
Yes.
So if you have members of the scheme who are not actually using or needing that membership at the moment, that creates a burden for Disclosure Scotland. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it creates it comes at a cost in terms of doing that monitoring, but there's also that intrusion into people's lives when there's absolutely no need for it because they're not doing regulated work.
Okay, but largely it's an administrative measure to avoid the scheme ballooning out of cost control and administrative control.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. But it has an impact on those who are members of the scheme in that they will have to, if they are using their PVG membership, they're going to have to renew it every 5 years. So what are the consequences for them in terms of cost and the burden of reapplication and so on likely to be?
In terms of the having to do the checks every 5 years, what we can see is that organisations are actually already introduced their own recurring checks. The Care Inspectorate recommends it as good a practice that organisations do a check every 3 years, and we can see from our data that organisations, including voluntary organisations, are doing that. Gerald?
I think it's also worth saying that we have tried many different ways to get people to voluntarily leave the PVG scheme when they're not doing regulated work. We've tried writing out to tens of thousands of people, and the returns on that have been very limited. And it's reputationally dangerous for the PVG scheme to get so large, you know, that it no longer bears any relationship to the actual number of people doing regulated work in Scotland. And it also offers us opportunities through the forthcoming fees consultation and the piece of work around working out how that will all be designed in co-production with the different employer groups and employees out there, to think about new ways to add value back in to the scheme for people during that 5-year tenure. And there's lots of thinking going on about how we can achieve that.
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
Well, different ways in which the scheme could be deployed. One of the policy ideas is, for example, that in return for the fee payable over a 5-year basis, an individual might not have to pay again in the 5 years to use the scheme. Now, if that were the case, there's lots of workers out there who are locum workers or who have low-paid jobs, but they have maybe multiple sites where they work,
right,
where they're paying again and again and again.
Right. Okay.
Do you know, and if there was a way to think about how we could drive value back into this new model, you know, of 5-year membership, then that's a conversation that we're very, you know, the government are very keen to have with stakeholders around how that can be achieved. And there will be a consultation process, and there is an ongoing dialogue taking place with unions and other organisations, employers, about how that might be done.
Okay, can I just track back to the daily monitoring? Can I just check, the suggestion is not that that changes, the suggestion is that you just control the size of the
Yes.
membership. So the daily monitoring would continue?
Yes.
You're not replacing that with
No.
5?
No.
Okay.
Yes.
Fine.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Ms Smith?
Can I, just before I ask my own question, can I just follow up on Ian Gray's question just now? After the 5 years is up, the person who has the PVG, is it incumbent upon them to follow it up with their organisation? I mean, do they have to pay again to do that, or what's the actual process for that?
In terms of the process, what the bill allows is a kind of buffer period. So before the end of the 5 years, the bill says that effectively Disclosure Scotland has to contact the individual scheme member and the organisations that are associated to their scheme membership to let them know membership is about to expire. Do you still need to be in the scheme or not? And then the renewals process can
At cost
start.
to them, or?
Well, in terms of that is, as Gerard has alluded to, that's a separate piece of work that we need to do in terms of working with unions and employers to understand how should that modelling work, because what we can see right now is there's question marks over whether the current modelling works, because right now what we can see is individuals who pay for the scheme themselves are having to pay the £59 disclosure or the £18 disclosure multiple times because they're moving around and new organisations are wanting access to their full disclosure. So I think there's work to be done in terms of understanding, do we have the modelling right? And you know, so I think that all the bill has done is said that there's provision is allowed for ministers to set the period at 5 years.
There's an important principal point here also, which is that that when we did customer research over the last few years, we found repeatedly that people don't often many people don't understand that they are in an actual membership scheme. They think that they've had a disclosure, you know, which is a bit of paper that they've had. They don't understand, some of them, that we're then monitoring them every single day, uploading, you know, over millions of records up to our systems and matching them against them to see if anything's changed, and that's unknown. So we need to rebrand PVG away from being a disclosure product to being a membership product. And with a membership product, you expect to get value back. You expect to have control over your information, and you expect to be able to use it in a productive way. So those are the kind of design principles that we're thinking about taking this forward. So it's likely that for a membership product to really succeed, the burden to pay it initially would normally rest with the member, but that doesn't mean that members couldn't come up with an arrangement with their employer to reimburse that, or any other arrangement that could be arrived at. Currently the law says that somebody pays, it doesn't say who will pay. It's very ambiguous about that, but we think that probably should change.
I just make the point because the last time, in fact the last twice we've had discussion about PVG at committee some years back, the cost factor was important. Because obviously there is an implication that in some institutions, schools for example, the cost falls on the school or the local authority to pay that. And if you're asking for that every 5 years, as opposed for a lifetime member, there are cost implications. I think it would be helpful if the bill team at some stage could do some analysis of the likely costs on that. I think that would be very helpful.
There has been some analysis done, and there's we have an understanding of how that might impact. As Kevin said, there are some cases where local authorities do pay fees and others where they don't. So there isn't a sort of homogenous position across the country about who pays fees for PVG. But having said that, it is clear that there will be, with any fee structure, there are winners and losers. There are some people who would have one disclosure and never ever darken our door again for a disclosure, and they would perhaps lose, over a 5-year model. But for those, and that's quite typical now with the gig economy and people moving about work and perhaps having, locum workers, supply teachers, doctors, nurses, etc., that people are increasingly using the scheme more and more in a 5-year period. So they will be winners on balance. So there will be swings and roundabouts, with this model.
Convener, I think it'd be helpful if we could, if that information could be shared with us, because I think it's quite...
If you could provide that, we'd be delighted to do that.
May I ask I think it's important to put on record that generally the reception to this bill is pretty positive. There are some issues, I think, about the meaning of relevant information. And can I just read one section of what the Law Society said in the evidence? They're saying that given the significant discretion that's been afforded to Disclosure Scotland to decide whether information in providing level 1, level 2 disclosure is to be included depends on the respective tests of ought to be included and relevant for the purposes of disclosure. They're asking some questions about the interpretation of that, because they say that it's not clear from the bill whether information must meet either or both of the ought to be included and relevant for the purposes of disclosure test. Could you just explain a little bit more about it? I think that's quite a genuine concern from the Law Society as to how that would be addressed.
In terms of the level 2 disclosure, there are two limbs to the test, and one is it relevant, and then the second part is the ought to be disclosed. That's because for access to level 2, the higher level information, there will always be a purpose for asking for access to that information, whereas with level 1 disclosures, that can be for any purpose. So it's just the simple question there is it meets the ought to. Recognise that the Law Society and other gatekeepers will have strong views in terms of how are these decisions going to be made, and what we are committed to doing is working in collaboration with stakeholders to develop a robust decision-making framework to make sure that those views are heard and that we deliver something that is in the best possible condition for stakeholders. Gerard, do you have anything to add?
Just to say that we have a significant amounts of experience in making decisions about the meaning of people's past criminal behaviour, or indeed government or rather police information in respect to whether they are or are not unsuitable to do regulated work with children or protected adults. We've been doing this for, well, the predecessor, the Disqualified from Working with Children team, and ourselves have been doing this for 15 years or more. So there's a lot of experience there in terms of making those decisions, weighing up those things, and we do it using a structured judgment protocol, and we would intend to use that experience and skill, that knowledge, as well as appropriate guidance and structured decision-making frameworks to make sure that's a fair and consistent process, and a reliable one as well.
Thank you.
Ms Mackay?
Yeah, I wonder if you could just clear up some confusion in my mind about the difference in the provisions in this bill and that in the Management of Offenders Scotland Act, where it's based on the date of convictions for under 18s. So how does that fit together?
The questions in terms of in the Management Offenders Bill, the rehabilitation period or the disclosure periods are based on the date of conviction. And, yeah, in terms of the provisions in our bill, the policy is that it is about behaviour of under 18s, and therefore it's not about the date of conviction, because sometimes somebody might carry out behaviour when they're under 18 and they might not, for some reason, be prosecuted for a number of months, just simply for admin reasons, or even for a number of years because of circumstances in the reporting of the offences. And given that the policy is to ensure that any behaviour of under 18s is dealt with by not automatically disclosing that behaviour, then this bill has to focus on the date of the actual behaviour and not the date of conviction.
I'm still slightly confused. Which comes first then? I mean, when taking the decision, is it the date or is it the behaviour?
In terms of the decisions about whether to disclose the conviction, then we will be looking at the date of the behaviour,
not the conviction,
not the date of the conviction,
right?
Which might be quite a few years later.
Okay.
And that seems it doesn't seem appropriate to treat if a 17-year-old commits a certain offence and they're convicted while they're 17, to treat that another 17-year-old who just happens to be convicted after the date of
so that's a judgment that is made on the behaviour?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mr Greer?
I'm interested in the rationale behind putting a lower age limit on PVG scheme membership. I was 15 when I started doing what would be regulated work for my church. It was a few years before PVG, so I got scheme membership later. I've got some specific questions around it, but I wonder if you could just start by explaining the rationale behind that change.
Yeah, certainly the idea behind that is that that whilst we recognise there are circumstances within which a disclosure may sometimes be appropriate for persons under the age of 16, the idea of PVG is this ongoing longitudinal membership of the individual in the scheme. And the policy thinking was that in most circumstances, a child who has something in their background or circumstances which would lead them to be under consideration for barring under the age of 16, for example, or involved with the police in a significant way, they would already be managed under the Getting It Right for Every Child process in terms of the police and social work and other organisations linking up to provide for the care and welfare of that person, as well as the management of any offending behaviour risk. So there was a feeling that the proportionality of allowing young people to come into the PVG scheme and have that ongoing monitoring overhead on them versus, the actual risk of not allowing that to happen and relying instead on the very robust procedures that are in place for young people's behaviour when they commit criminal behaviour or harmful behaviour, allowed us to strike that balance, which is consistent with, the rest of the United Kingdom, that it would be inappropriate on balance to have children under the age of 16 in the scheme. However, there will be circumstances in which it is possible. For example, when a family is about to adopt, it's sometimes, done that there's enhanced disclosures, obtained on all of the household members. That's still possible, so it's this working relationship, with PVG that was felt to be inappropriate under 16. And we do have very robust processes through the children's hearing system and youth justice arrangements to provide for a proportionate and fairer way to deal with those behaviours rather than put them into PVG. That was the policy thinking behind it.
Thank you. At the moment, how many under 16s or how many people have gained PVG membership when they were under 16? Granted, many of them will be at the age of 15, not long before.
The number of under 16s entering the PVG scheme going back to 2015 has been around about 300 a year. I mean, what I will say is the bill doesn't stop individuals under the age of 16 doing regulated roles. It disapplies the offence provisions that exist in terms of it being a mandatory scheme, in terms of for the individuals and organisations. So those arrangements can still happen, and that's really what the bill does. It just stops that kind of ongoing monitoring happening of children.
Yeah. My understanding is that the number of under 16s who are barred is, I guess, something like half a dozen. It's a very small number of under 16s to be barred by ministers. But there are instances where that's the case, and you've explained the systems that should already be ongoing for monitoring of those individuals. Many of those systems primarily are delivered through social work, which is delivered on local authority level, and it certainly wouldn't be the first time that a move between local authorities has resulted in a break in someone being effectively monitored and effectively supported. With this change, how does the system ensure that someone simply moving from one area to another continues to be appropriately monitored and, if required, would undergo a PVG check?
I think that the work that I've been involved with, the Age of Criminal Responsibility Bill team also, and the disclosure provisions around that Act, as it now is, and I would say that there's been a substantial amount of dialogue taking place around how we build a construct that's not a criminal construct to deal with young people under the age of 12, and how that behaviour gets managed in a way which is right for victims and right for public protection, as well as right for the child. And there's been lots of dialogue between police and social work as part of that process. That is a transferable process. There's been a significant understanding now, I think, that, and the figures reflect a very successful approach in Scotland to youth justice because of the reduction in youth criminality. That when organisations work together well, they do impact on this, and they do achieve success. And there has been evidence that that's been an ever improving position in Scotland. So I think that position can be relied upon. When you balance it against the detriments of having children in the PVG scheme, because there would be also detriments to having that on balance it's a better thing to do to have them managed within the existing constructs for youth justice and child welfare than it is to have them within a pseudo sort of criminal context.
Thank you. And just one final question, slightly unrelated to that point, but around the conditions that you would be able to prescribe under the bill. Those conditions are not detailed. That would be subject to further regulation. I understand why that is often necessary, but I'm often loath to give powers that are as yet undefined through a bill. Could you explain the timescale on which that regulation will be agreed that will specify what conditions you can set?
I'm afraid I'm not able to answer that just now.
Yeah, I think those regulations would be most likely to be just done in the context of implementation of the bill, if passed. So within a period of maybe a year. But as part of a planned programme of implementation, it wouldn't be the normal expectation of such regulation-making powers.
Could I say something about that? About those conditions, just to give a bit of the policy background to them, if that's of interest to you. The operation of the barring service, which I'm accountable for the barring service in Scotland, and in some cases we encounter individuals for whom we think their behaviour is extremely dangerous and risky. Very rarely, but we do. And when we do that, we don't have any powers just now to intervene to curtail or control the activity of the individual while they're in that period of being considered for barring. Once we bar them, yes, but before that, no. So we have in the past had to, have a period of time where there's risk. You know, and having the ability to have these conditions means that we can prescribe, you know, controls with short of barring someone, which you cannot do, you know, ahead of the process completing, you know, but short of barring them, you can put in place significant limitations on what they can and cannot do, which will be a substantial benefit to public protection, counterbalanced by the fact that we'd have to go to a sheriff to get the conditions imposed, so we'd have to make the case and prove that it was justifiable and proportionate. But this will be a significant benefit to the public to be able to take these conditions in those very few cases where an individual's conduct is such that that's an absolutely justifiable step to take.
I would agree that it is important that the power to impose those conditions exists. I think it is important for this committee to have an understanding of the process by which those specific conditions will come to. So if I understand you're not able to give that information now, if you could write to the committee as soon as possible, I think that would be quite helpful for us to have an understanding of the process by which you will come up with the specific conditions that are proposed and will eventually be potentially agreed under regulation.
Thank you. Dr Allen?
Thanks. Just to pick up on one of the points that Ross Greer was making there, and I apologise if I haven't picked up your answer completely here. You may have explained this one, but Ross Greer was giving an example, a hypothetical one, of a 15-year-old who's working perhaps with much younger children. It's very easy to imagine that happening in a charity or a church or somewhere. And you've explained that in that situation, if there were known to be allegations of criminality against that 15-year-old, that 15-year-old would already be in the system, as it were. I suppose my question is, how would the church or the charity concerned know that that 15-year-old was in the system?
So there are different ways that could happen. A child who's been involved with significant harmful behaviour will probably be part of a programme of care and welfare, which will have a social worker and perhaps other parties involved. The police continue to have a power to make a public interest disclosure in circumstances where they believe there's a significant risk to the public. They can inform an organisation, and what would likely happen from my experience is that the police would speak to the 15-year-old or his or her parents and say, look, you know, you need to understand that this is a significant risk that you're doing this work. We want you to tell the church or stop doing the work, and if they don't, then the police will make that disclosure. You'd be well advised to speak to Police Scotland about that process, because they do have a robust process for that kind of activity. But in general circumstances, a young person who's been involved in seriously sexually harmful behaviour, for example, there will be a significant and quite rigorous pattern of people around that individual, where it would be unlikely, I think, that the behaviour that you're worried about, quite correctly, would ever be able to be perpetrated because of that protection.
Thank you.
Ross? Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. When the minimum age of criminal responsibility bill was going through, there were quite a few, in fact, most of the children's organisations wanted to see the age raised higher than 12. And we did get a commitment from the government that they would look at raising it higher. Does the bill, as it stands in front of us today, make provisions for that raising of the minimum age?
All the bill does is, in terms of it sets out that the childhood convictions process applies to behaviour under the age of 18. It doesn't draw it at 12 to 17. It simply says under the age of 18. Is that right?
So the age of criminal responsibility is set by the Age of Criminal Responsibility Act, and that's not changed by this bill. So it's at 12, and obviously the government has undertaken to review that. In the interim period, while that review is ongoing, then behaviour of children between ages of 12 and 17 or 18, 17 will be dealt with in terms of this bill. So the age of criminal responsibility is completely separate from this bill. And I just wanted to ask a question about the fees. We touched on it earlier. What happens in the case of if somebody is contacted by Disclosure Scotland saying your 5 years is nearly at an end, you have a fee to pay by a certain date, and they don't pay it, and then they fall off the scheme? What implications does that have for their volunteering or their employment?
they wouldn't be paying a fee probably because the free checks will continue for volunteers in the policy intention is for that to happen. If when we check they're doing regulated work still or a regulated role and they haven't paid the fee, they will effectively begin to commit as well their employer a criminal offence because the scheme is mandatory. They have to join the scheme. They can't leave it if they're in a regulated role, and their employer can't employ them in that role if they're not in the scheme. So they will have to simply rejoin the scheme. They will not be allowed to leave, lawfully leave at that point. So yes, it would be obviously would have an approach to encourage people to without resorting to criminal proceedings against them, but ultimately that would be a criminal offence to do a regulated role without being in the scheme. So that would be the ultimate sanction, but there'd be many steps before that.
Procedures for what's called a period of extended scheme membership. For that case where someone fails to renew, but we're aware that they're still doing a regulated role. So they won't simply drop off out of the scheme exactly at 5 years. There will be this possibility to extend it, and then there is a process that's set out in the bill that will be gone through before someone, and at the point though that they fail to renew after various steps, then as Gerard says, they would commit an offence by continuing to work.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I think that exhausts questions from the members. Can I thank you for your attendance? We look forward to receiving the extra information that's been asked for by our members. But thank you very much for your attendance at committee today. The committee will be selecting future witnesses based on the evidence that we have received, and we will continue evidence taking in future committee meetings. And I'll suspend just for a few seconds to let you leave the room. Thank you. Back to committee members, we move to agenda item 4. The next item today is consideration of 2 pieces of subordinate legislation that are subject to negative procedure. The first is the University of the West of Scotland Order Council 2019 SSI 2019/212. Details are set out in paper 4. And the second instrument is the Queen Margaret University Edinburgh Scotland Amendment Order of Council 2019 SSI 2019/213, and this is set out in paper 5. Can I ask if any of the committee have comments on either of these instruments? No, thank you very much. Can now move to agenda item 5, which is European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. It's business to consider a proposal by the Scottish Government to consent to the UK Government legislating using powers under the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018 in relation to a UK statutory instrument proposal. The relevant statutory instrument is the European University Institute EU Exit Regulations 2019. Do any members have comments on the notification which is contained in paper 6? So that concludes the public session for this week. Next week we will take evidence on the Scottish Qualifications Authority on role and performance, and we'll now suspend for a few minutes as we move into private session.